Good evening. We are looking at our second lecture on media, and I just want to look at um, the functions and then government regulation of the media tonight, and then we'll look at how it links to politics in our third and fourth lectures. Now we know that mass media can be broken down into three major components: print media, electronic media, and of course now the internet. Print media has played a role in American politics since the beginning, when the early political parties established their own newspapers. And those newspapers were very, very partisan, not like most papers today, which can't be partisan, but not in-your-face partisan like the early newspapers. Now, electronic media became a force during the 20th century. First with the invention of radio in the 1920s, and then the invention and widespread access to television starting in the late 1940s, but in particular the 1950s and finally the 1960s. 60s are notable for the introduction of color. The internet was established in the 1970s, but it was more of an intranet, and it didn't become something that was used outside government until the early 1990s, and it has developed into the major medium of communication today. And it's probably been true for the last 15 to 20 years. Now, when we look at mass media, it performs four functions. First, of course, is entertainment, and we know that entertainment simply is the things that make you think, laugh, and both radio and television both emphasize entertainment. And primetime ratings for television often make or break the overall success of the networks and or the individual stations. Particularly in recent years, politics has been a topic for entertainment, with numerous movies focused on the president as the star of fictional political sagas. It really begins with the introduction of the West Wing in the late 1990s, which was kind of a takeoff on the Real White House office of President Bill Clinton. But it even survived a transition into the Bush administration and thrived until it ended in 2006, I believe. Saturday Night Live is also one that does a lot of political satire, poking fun at seemingly everybody, and that in essence is what it's supposed to do. And recently, of course, Netflix had its House of Cards and so on and so forth. When it comes to news reports, the function of the media is that news has been the major function of print media since the 19th century, and newspapers and magazines remain an important source for people who are interested in finding out what is happening in the country and the world outside. Now today, more people rely on television than newspapers and magazines, but more people now rely on the internet through the use of either their computers or their smartphones, which are small computers. And so things have changed in some ways drastically. Now, in the early days of television, news was generally reported every evening for about 15 minutes before the major night's entertainment began. Then, starting in the 1960s, the network news expanded to 30 minutes and in some cases 60 minutes. But cable news has made round-the-clock news reporting possible, especially with Fox, CNN, MSNBC focusing on news stories and commentaries. And we now have what's known as the 24-hour news cycle. Then there's agenda setting. Now, one important source of political, social, and economic power is the ability of the media to draw public attention to particular issues. Now, equally important are the issues that the media doesn't focus on. For example, the media may promote terrorism as a major issue in American society by airing the latest tape of the leader of ISIS. But at the same time, Americans may remain unconcerned about things like climate change. So issues come and go. They become important and they kind of fade away. So, for instance, the best example of that would be in 2014, our focus on Ebola. In 2015, will it be an issue? Who knows? Now, the media may promote a president's agenda by focusing on his proposals, or they may distract from a president's agenda by focusing on a sideshow, such as they did when Bill Clinton was president, and they focused on his personal life or his financial life, but not what he was doing politically. And of course, when we look at radio, conservative radio hosts such as Rush Limbaugh have developed large audiences that are influenced not just by the opinions expressed, but also are encouraged to focus on some issues but not on others. And then the creation of political forums. Well, politicians have learned to use the mass media to make important announcements or to encourage citizens to focus on their issues. The media wants to make politics interesting so that viewer ratings remain high, and politicians will respond to that by making news that will draw attention from the media. A presidential candidate may dress up in hunting gear, pose in a photo op with a respected former president. John Kerry did with Clinton in 2004. Certainly, even though he was the loser, lots of candidates want to bring Mitt Romney in 2014 during the midterms because it helped them draw attention to themselves or certain issues. Now, members of Congress may call attention to their causes through things like filibusters or public announcements of popular legislation that has been passed. The individual that has the most direct access to the media is the president, who may command prime time coverage for important announcements and speeches. That's why I call it here on the slide the electronic throne. The president has a huge ability to use that, and he uses it to a huge advantage over his opposition. Now, presidential press conferences usually get extensive coverage, and they may now on cable television. They certainly don't on the networks, and certainly again for the cable networks, the president's daily activities are also followed rather carefully. Hence, the focus on President Obama's playing golf so often. Now, when we look at the partisan press, we're looking at news that is reported from a particular stance. So it can be either a critique, which means it's a harsh treatment of certain issues or certain individuals, or it can be a benefit in which dissenting opinions or all opinions are looked at. And then we go to the public press, which developed because cheap newspapers, especially in the 19th century and well into the 20th century, really sprang up to account for the increasingly literate population that we had. That led to the mass circulation papers of the 19th and 20th century. Most of those are now gone. And it also highlighted the influence of certain individuals, and we did this in the first lecture, where we talked a little bit about Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, who is essentially the caricature of the excellent film Citizen Kane. Now, Joseph Pulitzer and Randolph Hearst not only delved into news and entertainment, but they also developed what was known as yellow journalism. It was sensationalist, it was influential, and it was designed to invoke passion among the readers on behalf of a cause. And then there are historically the opinion magazines. McClure's gone. Cosmo, believe it or not, Cosmo used to be an opinion magazine. It is now, but for other reasons. Collier's is also gone. And what those magazines did in the 19th century and into the 20th century was develop a style of reporting that was called investigative. And investigative reporting was looking at things in life that affected people in a negative way. So their focus was on revelations, on the underside of, let's say, industrialization. and society at the turn of the 20th century. So you see things like the octopus, um, uh, the, the, the expose, in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, things like that. That's what they were looking for. Ida Tarbell wrote about the history of Standard Oil Company. Lincoln Steffens wrote about wrote a book called The Shame of the Cities. Frank Norris had The Octopus. Upton Sinclair had The Jungle, etc., etc. Now, there's also the kind of standards that we need to talk about just a bit. In 1923, they developed the canons of journalism. Canon spelled C-A-N-O-N. And basically this laid out the principles of an objective press. And a press should strive to have the appearance of reporting all sides of all issues so that people then can make up their minds because they have the information. But the critique part of this is that there really is an impossibility when it comes to reporting all sides of an issue. There is an impossibility, I think, of what we call objectivity. Reporters write, and it's up to them to either include or exclude certain newsworthy items. We emphasize or we de-emphasize certain aspects of a situation. So, for instance, there's now been 6 video clips of Jonathan Gruber talking about how they pulled the wool over the eyes of Congress and the American people when it came to the ACA or Obamacare. Fox is playing it up. NBC kind of isn't. CNN is kind of somewhere in the middle. It's up to the networks, I guess, what they want to emphasize or de-emphasize. And also, there's the positive or negative slant to coverage. So, for instance, the soldier that was held in Mexico for 7 months, Henry Tamarisi, got a big play on Fox. It got no play elsewhere. Note that a program like Jon Stewart's program probably has never said a kind word about George W. Bush, whereas other ones are very praiseworthy of George W. Bush and his presidency. So, this positive negative slant is, again, it's kind of network, newspaper, print. The reporting is all over the place. And because it has gotten more, philosophically one way or the other, you see this all the time. So that's why you have to watch and be aware of the stance of websites and things like that when you're reading their material. Now, an interpretive press, it's really the job of the reporter to interpret and analyze what is said and done. But the critique of that is that many reporters advocate certain positions of either the establishment or their opponents. And you have to be aware of where they're coming from when you read their material. For instance, I was reading an article tonight that was published in the Washington Post by a Washington Post reporter who was talking about Valerie Jarrett, who is one of the advisors of President Obama, and it was called The 5 Myths. And honestly, I'm not even sure that she wrote it. It could have been written by the White House. The way it was such a puff piece, and so therefore you have to again watch and be aware of where the information is coming from before you can assess its validity. If you read the letters in there tonight, not many people were swallowing the line of the author of that piece. It was kind of an interesting little jaunt through current media. Now, let's head back to our look at what's big and what isn't. Now, we know that when it comes to print media, most of the newspapers today are still locally based, although many of them are part of massive media conglomerates like Gannett, which owns USA Today, Knight Ridder, Newhouse, Tribune. However, papers such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, which is now owned by Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, um, they have a national readership, which is why you will see the New York Times out here, and you can buy it at Barnes and Noble 7 days a week. Um, and because the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are all papers that have national readership, that makes them an important force in policymaking. Now, most magazines don't focus on politics, but news magazines, and we used to have a long list. Time is now electronic only. Newsweek, I think, may be gone. U.S. News and World Report is still around, but we only really talk about it when they come out with their rankings for universities and things like that. There's Nation, there's New Republic, there's The Economist, but that's really changed. Now, there are some major regional papers, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune. I've kind of abbreviated those. And what we also have to remember is that most smaller papers reprint the big stories from their larger brethren, so there's a kind of a continuity of news as it moves down the food chain from larger to smaller. Smaller papers usually have to buy their national news from bigger papers, whereas they themselves focus on local reporting of local news and events. Now, the sad thing for newspapers is that whereas in 1960, half of all Americans read the newspaper, by 2004, 1 out of 4 did. It doesn't mean that we're less informed. It just means that we have begun to cut newspapers out of our daily lives, and we find other sources that use that. Now, when we come to the news weeklies, I just want to look at the last two. I've already mentioned the first three. Time, I think, is electronic only. Newsweek may have gone by the wayside, and it was a rapid decline for both those papers, or both those magazines. The Economist is a worldwide magazine published in London, but it's one of those ones that is very influential. It is behind a firewall, but you can find many Economist articles from various sources. And the sad thing is that more people buy Playboy and People magazine, and those magazines are more profitable than Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, and that's one of the reasons why Time and Newsweek have virtually disappeared. They used to be a mainstay of doctors' offices and other places, and now you're not seeing them anymore, but you will always see people. You don't always see Playboy, but you will always see People or Us or OK or God knows. And some of the other ones that have disappeared, like Reader's Digest, we don't see those much anymore either. Now, we know the electronic media first came about in 1903, but it made its big debut in politics when a Pittsburgh station broadcast the 1920 election returns. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt used the radio very effectively in his fireside chats to the nation after he became president in 1933. The advent of television, or despite the advent of television in the mid-1920s, radio has remained, surprisingly, unlike newspapers, an important linkage institution to the population. And this is because so many Americans spend time in their cars and they listen to the radio. I'm one of those that listens to the two. I'll listen to KNX or I'll listen to KFI, and I don't listen to music very often. Conservative talk shows on radio provide commentary on national politics that they may not be getting on television. And things like National Public Radio puts a great deal of focus on political events and personalities through their programs like NPR or All Things Considered. Television's influence on the American public is tremendous, especially with the advent of cable television and the 24-hour news cycle and cable news networks. So Americans not only get their information from television, but they also listen to commentaries and analyses of the news. Now, what that has done is once media brought uh, government and politics into the home, it changed the nature of how politicians look at themselves, because now they had to uh, perceive how the audience perceived them. Uh, there's a lot of uh, there's a lot of verbiage around the 1960 television debates between Kennedy and Nixon, and there's a book that's just come out that kind of debunks a lot of the errata that has grown up. But one thing that has stayed is that uh, Nixon in 1960 put probably a little bit more pancake makeup on than he should have, and under the hot lights it did begin to run a little bit. So nowadays you'll notice when politicians make an appearance on television, it doesn't matter which cable news network, especially that you're looking at. Many times they're wearing a black suit, white shirt, or blue shirt, red tie. They've got an American flag on their lapel. They want to speak clearly and look directly into the camera and try to look their best. And sometimes you feel like it's style over substance when it comes to how politicians act. And what we also have to say before we move on from this slide is that television and radio are still the top source of news and news believability, and that's probably the little downside of the internet. Now, the internet, of course, has been the transforming technology, and the technology itself, the access that it has given to millions of people, has transformed communications in a very short period of time, especially since 1993. The internet has become the tool for research, and and it serves as the major entertainment outlet for millions of Americans and others. People across the globe may be instantaneously in communication with one another by email, and that means that we write less than we used to. But we write in different ways. We have blogs, and we're on Facebook, and certainly many of those things devote much time to political topics, but they devote more time to inanity than anything else. Internet communications has played, especially since 2000, has played an integral role in the election campaigns. The candidates themselves raise unprecedented amounts of money on campaign sites. Interest groups and their political action arms do the same thing. Remember that exit polls are the information is put on the net, so on and so forth. So it's had a huge effect on how we use news, how we deal with politics, and how we deal with information that pertains to politics. Now, when we look at government control of the media, as a general rule, print media has had much fewer government restrictions than electronic media or perhaps internet media. The First Amendment to the Constitution has been interpreted to mean that no government, either federal or state, can place prior restraint on the press before stories are published. Remember, we already looked at prior restraint. Once something is published, a newspaper or magazine may be sued or prosecuted for libel or obscenity, but these charges are difficult to prove. Most journalists value the confidentiality of sources, or the right to keep the sources for their information private, though there is a couple of interesting cases, one involving a New York Times reporter going on right now, and he is, or possibly will, serve time behind bars because he's being prosecuted by the U.S. government for the sources he's used in both his columns and in writing his books. However, the Supreme Court has upheld the right of the government to compel reporters to divulge information as a party to a criminal investigation. So if you are involved in that way, you will have to give up your sources or you're going to serve time. So the conflict between reporters and government is still an issue. And if we go back and take a look at that again, because the government might consider it criminal activity, it doesn't mean that it could be criminal activity. And what I mean by that is it sometimes perhaps the law hasn't reached that far to consider something to be criminal. For instance, the dispersal of government secrets could be like that. Now, so we have prior restraint on publication of material. There are some limitations on obscenity and libel. There are two court cases, and piece of government legislation that kind of has helped us along. The Freedom of Information Act of 1966 means that citizens have the right to gather material that the government has gathered on them and get a report of what's in your file. In Brandsburg v. Hayes in 1972, the court said that there's no guarantee of special access for the press to information not available to the general public. So the press can't hold itself in a special place, and it can't be treated any differently than the regular population in getting that information. And then in Richmond Papers, Inc. v. Virginia in 1980, the court said open access of press and public to criminal trials and the government bureaucracy is a must. You can't do a lot of these things behind closed doors. They've got to be open. Now, when it comes to the executive branch, the president has the responsibility of an appointment of people to sit on the FCC or the Federal Communications Commission. Those nominees are approved by the Senate. And of course, the president uses the White House press corps to communicate policies of the executive branch. And reporters travel, like the president is in the Far East at this time. The reporters from all the major networks and the cable news networks are traveling with the president, and they do this at taxpayers' expense, since it's a business expense. Then when we come to the legislative part, there are things that have happened. There's the appropriations of funding for the public broadcasting system, or what's known as PBS. The FCC was established in 1934, so and it was established for a number of things to help regulate the burgeoning airways. Remember, it was only 14 years before that radio reports of the election results in 1920 were done, and though TV hasn't come around yet, radio has expanded exponentially in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and is now it's the opposition to newspapers for getting information out. And we see any number of programs in which we can see where radio was extraordinarily important. Now, let me put it like this: broadcasting is carefully regulated by the government. No one may operate a radio or television station without a license from the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission. The government must renew licenses, and until recently, the FCC used its power of renewal to influence what the nation or what the station put on the air. So, for example, they might require a network to change their depictions of racial or ethnic groups, or restrict the number of commercials aired, or decrease the number of shows that emphasized violence. Starting in the 1990s, there was a movement to deregulate both television and radio. And with the increasing choice of television and radio shows available, not only over the air, but certainly through cable, pretty much everybody's needs were being met. Nothing was going undefined. So now many of the old rules are less vigorously enforced. Now, radio broadcasting has been deregulated more than television's. And in 1996, the government passed the Telecommunications Act, which was signed by President Clinton, which allowed one radio company to own as many as 8 stations in large markets and as many as it wished nationally. That has led to kind of the standardization of what you hear. So at the same moment you're hearing a song in Pittsburgh, you're also hearing it in Cleveland, Chicago, Omaha, and Reno, because it may be owned by the same company. In order to cut cost, they put the same material out, and then because they can send things electronically, um, it becomes cheaper and easier, but it also gets rid of innovation, and it doesn't fracture the market as much. Now, despite the trends, the content of radio and television is still regulated in ways that newspapers and magazines are not. So one example is the equal time rule, and that requires a station selling time to one candidate for office to make the same amount of time available to another candidate, as long as they can afford to buy the time. That could be a little bit of a problem for some. Also in force is the right of reply rule that allows a person who is attacked on a broadcast the right to reply over that same station. A candidate may also reply if a broadcaster endorses an opponent. Now, for many years, a fairness doctrine was also in place, which required broadcasters to give time to opposing views if they broadcast a program giving one side of a controversial issue. The FCC abolished the doctrine in 1987, arguing that it inhibited the free discussion of issues. However, most broadcasters still follow the rule voluntarily. Now, this is our look at the medium itself. The next lecture we're going to be talking about the media and political campaigns, so the impact of media on politics. I'm sure you can't wait. I certainly can't. So, and then we look at how the media deals itself with also government, and we'll get our first real look at the use of the electronic throne. So this ends lecture 2.